All right, Shabbosai, let us begin. Shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. The great, you thought you were going to have to wait months to have a Rosh Hashana, and now Baruch Hashem, we have the schus to begin Rosh Hashana today. Hey Cheshvan, I will say, first of all, Yeshachok to everyone who was part of the Siyum last night. Yeshachok to everyone who helped with the Siyum last night. It was such a magnificent and magical and uplifting event. You know, the one part that I forgot to mention last night at the Siyum was a Shevach and Hoda to the Lublin Rav, to the Meir Shapir of Lublin, who was the founder of the Daf. And the Lublin Rav, we've spoken about him many times in the past, was an incredible and singular type of personality. The Lublin Rav had no children of his own, no biological children. But the Lublin Rav has tens of thousands of children, because every single person who is one of the Lomdei Hadaf, if you glean spiritual life through Daf Yomi, then you are a child of the Lublin Rav. And it's always important to express recognition to your father, always important to express recognition to your Rebbe. So again, as we begin Maseches Rosh Hashana, we dedicate our learning in this Chusavah in Aliyah for the Neshama of Lublin Rav, that we, his spiritual children, should Meir Hashem continue to propel his Neshama mala, and Meir Hashem, we should give him nachas each and every day. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, our TALMUD TORAH sponsors. Our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, to thank Meir and Rachel Gold for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of Yonah Yitzchok ben Yosef Chaim Elazar HaKohen Zichron Livracha, and to thank Noam and Leah Efron for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in honor of the celebration of the 98th birthday of Noam's grandfather, incredible Yosef Hershel ben Mordechai Halevi. We wish him many years of gezunt and nachos al meh ve'esim shanim tovos. And I will say with that, let us begin. It's you almost feel a little bit giddy, starting a new Masechta. Says I will say also just there are notebooks. There are more notebooks, by the way. If you have not yet taken your Rosh Hashanah notebook, take it. Take notes. You have to take notes in the daf. Whether you take notes in the margin of your Gemara, not if you're using a shul Gemara, please. But if you're using your own Gemara, right? Take notes in the margin. Take a notebook. Write that every day. Take away something from the daf. A halacha, a hashkafa, a shakla v'tarya. Because the truth is, most of us, I think all of us, and I include myself in this, it's very difficult to retain everything that we do in the daf every day. But if you could retain something, if you walk away with a nugget, so you could look back at the end of the week, and even if you're not chazering 7 blot, which most of us are not doing, but you chazer what you remembered from each day, it's so meaningful, it's so significant. And remember, the other piece is, after 120, your children are going to go through your stuff. Your children are going to, which in general is a good musar, your children are going to go through your stuff, right? So you want them to find meaningful things. And you want them to find your Chidushei Torah. And you want them to find the ideas that you compiled. And you want them to find the evidence of your TALMUD TORAH. Because those will become the ultimate family heirlooms. So we'll see with that, let us begin. Arba'a Rosh Hashanah Heim. There are 4 Rosh Hashanahs. There are 4 New Years. What does it mean there are 4 New Years, says the Gemara? So, Be'echa b'Nisan Rosh Hashanah l'Malachim. On the 1st of Nisan is the New Year for kings. Now Rashi points out over here, l'Malachim, Regilim hayu limnos zman shtarosehem l'shnos hamelech. Mishana sha'amad ba hamelech yidarim sechas gein. I will say they used to date documents. We date documents. How do they date documents, says Rashi? They dated documents in accordance with the year of the reign of a particular king. And Rashi says over here, Mishum Shalom Malchus, the Kavu Chacham Ech B'Nisan. I will say, interestingly enough, this is lav dafka by Jewish kings, right? This was also by non-Jewish kings, as we'll discuss. In any event, they used to go ahead and date their shtaros by the reign of the king. Well, if you're going to date by the reign of the king, you have to know when the year begins and when the year ends. So the 1st of Nisan is the Rosh Hashanah for kings. Ula Regalim, and for Yamim Tovim. We'll discuss exactly what that means in the Gemara. That's our first. So I'll say Rosh Hashanah number 1, 1st of Nisan. Rosh Hashanah number 2, Be'echad Be'elul, Rosh Hashanah L'Maiser Behema. On Elul, on Rosh Chodesh Elul, is Rosh Hashanah for Maiser Behema. So we'll say, let's talk about this in just a moment. What does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. L'Maiser Behema. So Rashi says over here, L'Maiser Behema, She'in Ma'asun Min Hanoladim Mishana Zu, Al hanoladim bechaberta. I will say a very important yisod that we have in general is this concept that when tithing, you cannot tithe from one cohort onto another cohort. This is going to be true with really any type of trumas and maestros. You have to go ahead and tithe from that year's cohort. Now, in order to tithe from that year's cohort, you have to know what's the beginning, what's the end. So we're going to see for animals, for Meiser Behema, it's Rosh Chodesh Elul, which means any animals born between this Rosh Chodesh Elul, right, Rosh Chodesh Elul A, and Rosh Chodesh Elul B, are considered to be part of one group, one cohort, and therefore are tithed from one another. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omen, Be'echar B'Tishrei. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon say that no, it's not Rosh Chodesh Elul, rather it's Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So Rabbi say, so again, this is our first machlokes. So remember again, interestingly enough, when it comes to Rosh Hashanah for Malachim and Regalim, no machlokes. Everyone agrees that Allah Lamaisa, it's the first of Nisan. When it comes to Rosh Hashanah for Meiser Behema, now we have a machlokes. Is it going to be Rosh Chodesh Elul or is it going to be Rosh Chodesh Tishrei? Again, we'll see the svaras for both sides. Next, Be'echad B'Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah l'Shanim, l'Shmitim, u'Yovlos. So we'll say for Rosh Hashanah of Tishrei. So first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah l'Shanim for years, which I will say ultimately again means for the calendar. L'Shmitin u'Yovlos. Take a look at Rashi. What does that mean? The Shmitin u'Yovlos. Mishenichnas Tishrei asr lachrosh v'lizroa min haTorah. Both say this is very important in halacha l'maisa. When Tishrei begins, the prohibitions of Shemitah and prohibitions of Yovel. We're going to see Yovel, or I should say halachos of Yovel kick in. Now, both say we're going to see something very interesting when it comes to Shemitah, that halacha l'maisa, although Shemitah biblically begins the first of Tishrei, there are elements of Shemitah which already begin from Chodesh Elul. This is a very lemaisa discussion right now. In any event, we're going to explore all of this in Yirtzeh Hashem. So Shemitah liovlos, ulenetia, uliyarakos. So we'll say similarly again, the first of Tishrei is also the Rosh Hashanah for Netia. Rashi says over here, leminyan shane shnei arla vafilu nata ba'av kolsa shna sarishona l'sof Elul. So we'll say first of Tishrei is also the new year for trees. Now, again, not for trees like Tu B'Shvat, we'll get to in just a moment, but rather again for the halachos of Arla. Arla says that what? You cannot consume the fruit of the tree for the first 3 years. How do you measure a year for Arla purposes? Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. Then I will say, you're going to see, by the way, the reason why this is important is because as follows. What this means for us practically is, if you go ahead and you plant a tree in Av, you plant a tree, well, it wouldn't be Rosh Chodesh Av, but you plant a tree on the 10th of Av, right? So interestingly enough, comes Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. How old is that tree? 1 year old. So we're going to see this concept over and over and over, that essentially, really, as long as you get started in the previous year, once your Rosh Hashanah comes, you are already locked into a year. So again, we've got Rosh Chodesh Tishrei so far as being the Rosh Hashanah for years. Shemitah, Yovel, Netia, which means Arla, Uli Yerakos. What's Yerakos? Rashi says Yerakos, Lemaiser Yerek, Shein Tarmenu Ma'aser Mina Niklat Lifnei Rosh Hashanah, Al Shal Ach Rosh Hashanah. So we'll say Yerakos means for tithing vegetables. So the year for, again, remember, we'll say Klal Gadol when it comes to Trumas and Maestras is you can only tithe from one cohort. So again, you have to lock in a group. You have to create what is your defined tithing population. Well, in order to do that, you need a beginning of the year, you need an end of the year. So for Yerakos, Rosh Hashanah is going to be the first of Tishrei. Well, so now we come probably to what is the most famous part of this Mishnah. Be'echad b'Shvat Rosh Hashanah le'ilan. On the first of Shvat is going to be the Rosh Hashanah for the trees, or for the tree. Rashi says over le'ilon, le'inyan meiser. We'll say once again, this is talking about tithing of fruit trees, right? Of fruits that grow on trees. So once again, you have to know, we'll say, now we're going to discuss, by the way, an interesting discussion when it comes to fruit trees is when are you koveya the tithing obligation? Is it at Chanata, when the fruit blooms? Is it when the fruit becomes ripened? Again, we're going to see these all exciting discussions ahead of us. In any event, the point over here for our purposes today is on the 1st of Shvat, is the Rosh Hashanah for Ilan, for trees. Kedivrei Beis Shammai. That's the position of Beis Shammai. And what does Beis Hillel hold? Beis Hillel Omrim, Bechamisha Asar Bo. Beis Hillel says, no. When is Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanos? When is the new year for trees? Ultimately, again, says Beis Hillel, it's Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat, Emir Hashem, we will see, I will say, what is at the core of that machlokas. Because I want to tell you something absolutely beautiful on this Mishnah. So, in the Sefer Sifsei Chachamim, he asks an interesting question. I want to quote to you. He says, L'chora, listen to this shaila on the Mishnah, Me'achar sheshem Mesecha zu Rosh Hashanah, Lefi she'ikara al Kedushas Yom HaDin HaKadosh Rosh Hashanah. Now, I will say, it's important to know, what's the primary topic of Maseches Rosh Hashanah? Take a wild guess. Good, Rosh Hashanah. Which Rosh Hashanah? Which Rosh Hashanah? Our Rosh Hashanah. The 1st of Tishrei. The primary topic of this Masechta is what we colloquially call Rosh Hashanah. Our Rosh Hashanah. The 1st of Tishrei. The Yom HaDin. That's the primary topic of this Masechta. Imkain, listen to this, as a Sisei Chachamim, if that's the case, what should the Masechta have started with? What should the Masechta have started with? 1st of Tishrei. 1st of Tishrei. Imkain min aroi ha'ilahashil, dalid Rosh Hashanim heim, be'echad be'tishrei. At the end of the day, this is so fascinating. The Iker topic of the Masechta is what we call Rosh Hashanah, the 1st of Tishrei. That's the Iker topic. And so I understand you want to introduce the Masechta. Arba Rosh Hashanahim. There are 4 Rosh Hashanahs. Shouldn't the first one you discuss ultimately again be the 1st of Tishrei? Should it? Why don't you, first of all, even just calendrically, the 1st of Tishrei is the beginning of the calendar year. Doesn't it make sense to begin with that particular Rosh Hashanah? Why do you start? The Sisei Chacham says, why do you start with Be'echad B'Nisan Rosh Hashanah L'Malachim? The Sisei Chacham goes on for an arichos. He gives a different answer, but I want to share with you something amazing. The Magid of Mezrich, Sechusa Yagein Aleinu, says something amazing. He says, what is the worst sin that a Jew could commit? The worst Aveira. Don't blurt anything out, right? The worst Aveira a Jew could commit, says the Magid of Mezrich, is that we forget that we are B'nai Malachim. We forget that we are royalty. That's the worst sin a person could commit. And at first glance you say to yourself, really? That's the worst? I could think of a lot of worse Averas. And the Rebbe says, yes, I'll tell you why. Because when you hold yourself to a standard of royalty, when you believe that you are someone special, when you believe that you are monarchical, ultimately that informs the way, bless you, that informs the way you behave, and that informs the way you live, and that informs every aspect of your life. But when I forget that I am royalty, when I forget that I am special, when I forget Banim Atem LaHashem Elokecha, when I forget that if I am the son of a king, that means that I too am a prince, and I too have the ability to be a king. When you forget that, then anything and everything becomes possible. And perhaps it was by design that even though this Masechta is about primarily the Rosh Hashanah, which occurs on the 1st of Tishrei, it's by design that the Mishnah begins with Be'echad B'Nisan Rosh Hashanah L'Malachim. The first Rosh Hashanah that the Mishnah begins with is the Rosh Hashanah about kings. Because the most important thing we have to instill within ourselves over and over and over each and every day is I am royalty. I am monarchical. I am holy. I am special. That's how I have to behave. That's how I have to live. And that's how I have to conduct myself. That's why perhaps Chazal chose to start the Mishnah with the Rosh Hashanah L'Malachim to remind us to ultimately be royal in the way we approach our life, in the way we approach our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the way we live. Says the Gemara, L'Malachim L'may Chazi, sorry. So the Gemara says, what does this mean ultimately that the 1st of Nisan is the Rosh Hashanah for Malachim? Practically speaking, what does that mean? Amr Chista l'shtaros. So as we said before, the ramification of this is for shtaros, for dating documents. This nan, I both say this is very beautiful. This nan, shtari chov hamukdamin psulin. Both is just an interesting halacha. Predated documents are puzzle. Yet v'hameucharin ksherin. Ultimately, again, post-dated documents are kosher. Now, interestingly enough, what's the difference between predated documents and post-dated documents? So look at Rashi. This is really fascinating. Shtari chova mukdamim psulin. Lefi sheratza lekuchos shelakchos sadem min haloba mizman shebishtar v'shelo kidinhu sharkima mechira lava. So listen to this. Let me take this outside, and then we'll see Rashi inside. In general, if I lend Ruvain money, so generally I have a lien against his property. Now, not only that, but so I have a lien against any property he owns at the time of the loan. Now, I want to point out, you could structure transactions in different ways that there's no lien on the property. Well, when we get to the babas, in Meir Hashem, we'll discuss that. But bepashtos, when I lend Ruvain $1,000, I have $1,000 lien against his property. Now, that lien only devolves upon property that he owns at the time of the loan. But properties, and by the way, not only that, if he subsequently sells property, could Ruvain sell property after I lent him money when there's a lien against the property? Could he sell it? Absolutely, you could sell it, but what? If Ruvain defaults, I have the ability to seize that property from the lekuchos, from the people who purchased him, who purchased encumbered property. But I will say, but obviously the encumbrance, the lien, only applies to properties that were owned by Ruvain at the time of the debt. Properties that were sold by Ruvain prior to the debt, right, are totally unencumbered. I have no shaykhus to those particular properties. What's the problem with the shtar mukdam? Right, we'll say today is Hei Cheshvan. So you know what? I say to Ruvain, let's just date our document Beis Cheshvan. What's the problem with that? If Ruvain went ahead and sold property between Beis Cheshvan and Hei Cheshvan, I now have a loan document that says Beis Cheshvan, which according to the document says the loan was made on Beis, which means that the encumbrance begins on Beis. But what that could lead to is an illegal seizure of property. Because Lamaisa, the real encumbrance doesn't begin until Hei. So that's why you're not allowed to have a shtar mukdam. You're not allowed to have any type of pre-dated document. I'll tell you, by the way, where this comes up it doesn't come up all the time, but where sometimes it creates attention. We'll say this is why by a ksuva, a ksuva must be dated on the same date as the chuppah. Because if the ksuva is dated, let's say today's Hei Cheshvan, but the chasana is running late. Sometimes it's been rumored that chasanas run late, right? The chasana runs late, and the chuppah is going to take place after shkia, after sunset. That means the chuppah is taking place on Vav Cheshvan. The ksuva is dated on Hei Cheshvan, and the problem ultimately is what? A ksuva is a document which creates an encumbrance. Remember again, your wife has an encumbrance against what? Everything. Everything. Right? In the ksuva it says, Afilu min glima dal kasvoi. Even the shirt on your back. The ksuva is the most far-reaching document that exists in halacha. Everything is encumbered by it. That's why, interesting enough, Minhag Yerushalayim, it is something very interesting. It might be outside of Yerushalayim also, but it's known as Minhag Yerushalayim. They sign the ksuva under the chuppah. The dafka sign outside of Eretz Yisrael, here in America, they do it by the chasan's tish. In Eretz Yisrael, at least Minhag Yerushalayim, is they dafka do it under the chuppah, so that there should be no issues of predating. So we'll say that's a shtar mukdam. What's a shtar mu'ocher? So just the opposite. What's the shtar mu'ocher? So shtar mu'ocher today is Hei Cheshvan, and you know what? We decide to date the document Vav Cheshvan. I both say, who does that put at a disadvantage? The lender. Right? Because now, technically speaking, what that means is, I lent Reuven $1,000. I lent it to him today on Hei Cheshvan. So we date the document Vav Cheshvan. So what happens? That means if Reuven sells property today, right? Technically speaking, I can't seize any property that was sold before Vav. Is what's called a shtar mu'ocher, a post-dated document. Is a post-dated document mutter? Is it mutter? It is, as long as the lender agrees to it. In other words, if I as the lender am okay with being put at a disadvantage, that's fine. You see, a shtar mukdam, a predated document, is asr. Because a predated document puts other unassociated parties with the loan, puts them in jeopardy. Because now, again, if I predate it, I could potentially go and seize property from other people that Reuven sold to if he defaults. And that's not fair, because the truth is really their property is unencumbered. A post-dated document only puts me, the lender, in jeopardy. If I choose to accept that level of risk, that's my business. So back to the Gemara. So when the Gemara says, what does it matter when we say that Rosh Chodesh Nisan is the Rosh Hashana L'Malachim? Amrav Chistel Shtaros Disnan Shtari Chof Hamukdamin Psulin. Predated documents will be pasul. V'hameucharin ksherin. But post-dated documents ultimately are kosher. And I will say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, you have to know how to date the documents. Well, so I'll just tell you something beautiful. It's such a Yitzchok to get carried away with all the beautiful Torah that comes up on this. But say, Meir Premishlan, Zechusa Yagin Alinu says on this line, listen to his drush on this line. He says, the Rebbe Shalom says to us this line, Shtarei Chof HaMukdamin. He says to Klal Yisrael, I have some old documents against you. Some old claims. Shtarei Chov HaMukdamin. I have some old claims against you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Afsal Osam. I'm willing to passel the Shtarei Mukdamin I have against you. On one condition. V'hameucharin ksherin. If you make a choice and you make a promise to be kosher from this point going forward, I'll passel, I'll negate, I'll void, I'll tear up all of the old claims. Rav Meir Premishlan, Shtari Chov HaMukdamin. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has claims against us. He does. He has tinus against us. He has shtaros against us. There are documents against us. We all have, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has claims against all of us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'll passel every single one of them. I'll rip them up. As long as HaMilcharin Ksherin. As long as you promise from this point going forward to be a kosher, I'll rip up everything from the past. Incredible. Rameir Premishlan. So says the Gemara. We should probably do a little Gemara today. Says the Gemara. So much. I will say again, remember, this is why we learn Gemara. It's not a tangent. It's not a tangent. It's hafach ba v'hafach ba dekula ba. Everything is in Daf Beis Rosh Hashana. Tanrabanan melech she'amad be'esrim v'tisha ba'adar. So let's listen to this. A king who starts his reign. So we'll see, now we're going to go through a whole bunch of cases about kings and how ultimately, again, the dating system works with their reign. So here we go. Tanrabanan melech she'amad be'esrim v'tisha ba'adar. If the king goes ahead and assumes his throne on the 29th of Adar. So let's remember again. 29th of Adar is what? Is what? The day before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Kevan sheyagia echad b'Nisan also lo shana. Once the first, so both said, this is the theme we're going to keep on seeing. So if the king ascended his throne on the 29th of Adar, once Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes, that's reckoned as what? 1 year. He's into his, so now essentially when Rosh Chodesh comes, that is considered to be what? The beginning of the second year of his reign. Even though effectively, he's been on the throne for a day, or now 2 days, right? It's 2 years. V'im lo amad ela ba'echad b'Nisan, in monon lo shana, ad sheyagia Nisan acher. But of course, if he assumed his throne after Rosh Chodesh Nisan, then halacha l'maisa, his full year is only considered to be complete when he gets to the next Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Okay, so the Gemara says, Amar Mar, Melech she'amad be'esrim v'tisha ba'adar, if the king ascends the throne on the 29th of Adar, Kevan she'egia echad b'Nisan al salo shana, once the first of Nisan comes along, that counts as a year. So ha kamash rabba say, what do we see from this? Amad Beis. Ha kamash malon, the Nisan, Rosh Hashana l'malachim. So there are two things we learn from this. Number one, that Nisan is considered to be the Rosh Hashana for Malachim. And Abba said, what else do we see? V'yom echad b'shana chashuv shana. And 1 day of the year is counted as a year. So Abba says, so again, there's a very important yisod. So it's two things. Number one, reinforcing what the Mishnah said, that Rosh Chodesh Nisan is the Rosh Hashana for Malachim. That's Aleph. And Beis, Yom echad b'shana Chashuv Shana, 1 day of the year, because remember, if the king ascended the throne on the 29th of Adar, ultimately again comes Rosh Chodesh Nisan, that is counted as if he has reigned for an entire year. I will say, what an incredible musr in that line. Yom Echad B'Shana Chashuv shana. Sometimes you could infuse meaning into an entire year by just living one impactful day. And sometimes a person could accomplish in one day what it sometimes takes an entire year. Say this. We're going to develop this sort of a little bit more of Yom Echad B'Shana Chashuv Shana. So here, actually we'll go a little bit weiter, then we'll come back to it. Ve'im lo amad ela be'echad b'Nisan. So we're going to go through a couple of other cases. And if the king only ascends the throne on the 1st of Nisan, ein monin lo shana ad she'yagia Nisan acher. So remember, we're just dissecting the brisa. If the king ascends the throne on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so the year is only reckoned when you get next year. Yeah, you go through in that case, you go through a full 12 months, right? Or whatever, if it's a leap year more. And ultimately, the first year of his reign is only considered to be complete when he reaches next Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So Pshita, the Gemara says, okay, that's kind of obvious. Lo tzricha de'imnu aleh me'ada. So Rabbi say, listen to this. So remember, case number one, Rabbi say, is king ascended the throne on, we'll call it the 29th of Adar. Once Rosh Chodesh comes, that is considered to be year one. Okay, so now he's a year. King ascends the throne on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. He is only considered to have had 1 year of his reign until he gets to when? The following Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So Gemara says, that's obvious. Oh, what's the Chiddush? This is very interesting. Di'imnu alei. Now we'll say the case over here is Di'imnu alei me'adar. They already appointed the king on the end of Adar. Look at Rashi. Di'imnu alei. Nimnu v'gamru hasarim limnoso. The case I will say is they already voted him into the monarchy. I will say it's interesting. The Malbim in the beginning of Megillas Esther discusses historically the different types of monarchies which existed throughout history. There was a constitutional monarchy, right, and there was more like I guess we'll call it like a autocratic type of monarchy. So a constitutional monarchy was the king was voted into office, right? He was voted in, and he could be voted out, right? In a more despotic or autocratic type of monarchy, the king has absolute power. The reason the Malbim brings it up, interestingly enough, in the beginning of Megillas Esther, is because the Malbim, it's actually incredible Malbim. He discusses that Achashverosh's entire intention, the Babylonian monarchy, was a constitutional monarchy. And the whole chap of that Achashverosh wanted to do was to consolidate absolute power in the monarchy. He did not want to be reliant on others. In any event, the point that the Gemara is making is, what happens if they essentially voted the king into office at the end of Adar? So they voted him in. So in other words, he got the job already at the end of Adar, but he didn't officially assume monarchical responsibilities until Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So you might have thought, what? You might have thought that like this. Once he was voted into office, so to speak, and he was voted in at the end of Adar, therefore what? The job was his. The job was his right at the end of Adar. Really, we should count it as, when did he ascend the monarchy? When? In Adar. And therefore, once Rosh Chodesh Nisan rolls around, he's entered into the second year of his role. Kamash Malon, that's not the case. Kamash Malon, that when does the king become the king? Only when he actually assumes responsibility. Incredible. Tan Rabban, I will say a lot of musar in that also. The king is only the king, not when he's king in title, only when he's king in responsibility. Tan Rabbanon, we'll say, listen to this. Meis ba'adar va'amad achar tachtov ba'adar. Listen to this. The king died during Adar, and another king, the replacement was installed in Adar. What's talach? It's a very interesting case. Monin shana lezeh ulezeh. So this is actually a fascinating case. Let's say King A dies in Adar, and King B is installed, ascends the monarchy in Adar. So remember again, that year is reckoned for both monarchs. So it's the final year of monarch A's rule, and the first year of monarch B's rule. Now remember again, this is all important because, again, for our purposes, why? For the dating of shtaros. So remember again, what that would mean is effectively, you could date your shtar in one of two ways. You could date your shtar the last year of King A's reign, or the first year of King B's reign, and both of those dating systems are going to be correct. So the Gemara says, Mon shana lezeh u lezeh. Rashi says over here, Habal lichtov, second line from the top of Rashi, Habal lichtov shtar ba'adar la'achar sha'amar hasheni, imratza lichtov b'shtar b'shana plonis l'melech shemes kosev, v'imratza kosev b'shana rishona l'melech ploni shalom. So we'll say you have a choice as to how you want to date that shtar. Good, that's case one. Case two, Meis b'nisan va'amad achar tachtov b'nisan. What happens if monarch A dies in Nisan and monarch B ascends the throne in Nisan? What's the halacha? Monin shana lazeh, shana lazeh. It's the same halacha. Well, it's the same halacha. So essentially, again, so you could date the shtar. You could date the shtar the last year of King A's rule or the first year of King B's rule, and both of those are legitimate ways to date the shtar. Next, Meis ba'adar va'amad achar tachtov b'nisan. If King A dies in Adar and King B isn't installed or doesn't ascend until Nisan, what's the halacha? Monin rishona l'rishon, ushniya l'sheni. Ultimately, you're going to say that means the previous year is reckoned as the last year of King A's rule, and now the new year after Nisan is reckoned as the first year of King B's rule. Okay, Amar Mar. So we'll say let's analyze these cases. Amar Mar. Meis ba'adar va'amar achar tachtav ba'adar modin shana lazeh uluzeh. So let's listen to this. So we're now going to dissect the brisa. Case number one was King A died in Adar, King B was installed in Adar. So what's talacha? You can date the shtar either last year of King A or first year of King B. Subshita. The Gemara says, okay, that's obvious. What's the chiddush in that? What would you have thought? You might have thought that 1 year cannot be associated with two different monarchies. In other words, we'll say, first of all, the real Havamina is, right, it doesn't make sense to associate 1 year with two monarchies. It also, by the way, one would have to imagine, could create some level of confusion in the dating of documents also, right? In other words, what does that mean? Some are having it last year of King A, first year of King B. So you might have thought that 1 year cannot be associated with two different monarchies. Kamash Molon, that's not the case. Kamash Molon again, we'll say, this is very reminiscent of the exchange between the sun and the moon, right? You remember again in Bereshis we had that the moon said, right, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the Shnei HaMa'oros HaGedolim. So first they're created as two large luminaries, and then later on in Bereshis it refers to the Ma'or HaGadol, the sun, to shine by day, Ma'or HaKaton, L'Memshalas Ba'layla. So asks Rashi HaKadosh, what happened? They started as two large luminaries, now there's one big, one small. So remember, we know the famous Medrash that says that what happened? The moon said, Ein shtei melochim mishtamshem mekeser achos. Two kings can't share one crown. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, you're right. Well, you're not right, you're wrong. But because you thought that, Lech umi eit es atzmech. Go and diminish yourself. And so the moon becomes the diminished luminary. It's incredible. The Gemara says, you might have thought that two kings can't share 1 year. Kamash Navo say that life is all about learning how to share the crown. Right? That life is all about learning how to coexist and to make space for others. Incredible yisod. Meis b'nisan va'amed achar tachtav b'nisan. So we're just going through. We read the brayos. We went through all the cases. Now we're just going ahead and dissecting those cases. Next, Meis b'nisan va'amed achar tachtav b'nisan monesh shana lazeh ulazeh. So let's listen to this. King A died in Nisan. King B ascends the throne in Nisan. So what's the halacha? That year is the last year of King A, first year of King B. So Pshita, the Gemara says, that's obvious. Mouthed him, what would you have thought? This is incredible. Ki amrinan yom echa b'shana chashav shana, b'sof shana. But say, listen to this. I would have thought that when we say 1 day is considered to be a year, that's when? At the end of the year. So we'll say, when do we say Yom Echad B'Shana Chashuv Kishana? That 1 day of the year is like a year. That's when it's the last day of the year, right? So again, King A dies and King B ascends the throne the last day of the year. I hear that. Then that year could count as the last year of King A, first year of King B. That makes a lot of sense. Ava B'Tchilas Shana Lo Aminan. But I will say, if all you are is king for the first day of the year, if all you are as king is first day of the year, and then you die, right, and then you're no longer king, I would have thought that's not called a year, right? Or else I say, so if King A dies on the first day of Nisan. Now, come on, you're going to give him that year. You're going to attribute that year to his reign. That doesn't make sense. Kamash Shmuel Abba said, the Gemara says, no, we say Yom Echad B'Shana Chashuv Kishana, that one day is considered to be like a year, whether that one day is the beginning of the year or whether that one day is the end of the year. I would say, what an incredible Musar Haskell as well. Because Yom Echad B'Shana teaches us another important hashkafic concept, which is that sometimes, first of all, a person could redeem a year, an entire year in one day. You see that the Svarim are filled with this concept when it comes to the end of the calendar year. We come to the end of Chodesh Elul, and we realize that there's so much work we have to do that I haven't done. You could redeem an entire year with one day of avoda. But I think it also goes the opposite way. That sometimes we have just a couple of days of meaning throughout an entire year. And sometimes it's easy to think that if it's just a little bit of ruchnius here, a little bit of ruchnius there, but it's not sustained, I'm not able to keep it up, I'm not able to perpetuate it, that it doesn't mean anything. But what is the Gemara teaching us? Yom echad b'shana chashuv kishana. One day of accomplishment, one day of being a melech, one day of being a king, one day being on top of your game, one day accomplishing, that's really meaningful. That's really meaningful. And whether that day is at the beginning of the year, because sometimes, we begin the year strong and then we peter out. Or whether that one day is at the end of your year, because sometimes it just coast through the year and then wake up at the end. Whenever your day is, never think that just because you can't or you haven't sustained something, that your episodic holiness is not meaningful. It's not true. Yom echad b'shana chashav kishana. Whenever a yid does something good, whenever you do something holy, whenever you're the best version of yourself, even if it's just for a couple of moments, or for a couple of hours, or for a day here and there, Yom Echad B'Shana Chashav Kishana. Whenever you have moments of great spiritual accomplishment, that is exceptionally meaningful in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Incredible Yisod. Next, Meis Ba'adar V'Amar Achar Tachtav B'Nisan. The next case was, the king died in Adar. And ultimately, again, another king was appointed. So King A died in Adar, King B was appointed in Adar. So I'm sorry, V'amar achar tachtav b'Nisan. So we'll say in this case, King A died in Adar, King B doesn't come onto the scene until Nisan. Monin Rishona l'Rishon Shni l'Sheni. So we'll say, okay, so therefore again, we'll call it year 1 is attributed to the last year of the reign of King A, and year 2, post Nisan, is year 1 of King B. Pshita. Okay, that's obvious. We'll say, watch this. No, because what's the case we'll say? King A died in Adar, and when was King B officially, when was he voted in? When was he voted in? In Adar. Not only that, Umelech ben Melechu. Not only that, but King B is the son of the now deceased King A. So we'll say, you might have thought that what? Ma'adatema, Nimnule, Tartinshnin. So we'll say, I'm going to feel like this. In a case where King A died in Adar, and King B didn't officially assume his monarchical positions until Nisan, but he was voted into office in Adar, and he's also the son of the deceased king. I might have thought all of that connection to the throne should make it as if what? As if he's ascended the throne on Adar, and therefore again, year 1 should count as last year of King A, year 1 of King B, and now when Nisan comes, it should be year 2 of King B. Kamash Malon. Rabbi said, Kamash Malon, you're only the king when you assume the responsibilities. Just because you've been voted in, and even if your father is the king, you're only the king if you assume responsibility. Rabbi say, you only accomplish great things in life, and you are only considered to be in a position of influence if you have responsibilities. Titles mean nothing. Responsibility means everything. The king is only the king when he assumes the reins and responsibilities of the kingdom. Incredible. So we'll say, now let's analyze. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say, now we've gone through pretty much every single variation of this case, and now we understand quite clearly that halacha l'maisa, the Rosh Chodesh for Malachim is going to be the first of Nisan, right? And we've seen all the variations. Says the Gemara, Amar li Rabbi Yochanan, minay l'malachim she'mornin la'mel Nisan. Where do we know this from? In other words, who chose that? Who made that decision? We see it in the Mishnah, obviously. But where does this come from that we go ahead and and we count for kings from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So says fasting. Shneimar vahi b'shmonim shana va'arba me'os shana l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim b'shana haravius b'chodesh Ziv hu ha'chodesh hasheni l'melech Shlomo al Yisrael. So I'll say over here, the Gemara is quoting from the pasuk in Malachim, and it's talking about the reign of Shlomo HaMelech. And interestingly enough, how does it refer to the reign of Shlomo HaMelech? It refers to it as 480 years from the time we left Egypt, from the time we left Mitzrayim. Makish Malchus Shlomo Yitzias Mitzrayim. So we'll say, interestingly enough, what is the pasuk doing? It's comparing the reign of Shlomo to the Exodus, to Yitzias Mitzrayim. Ma Yitzias Mitzrayim min Nisan, Af Malchus Shlomo min Nisan. Just like we left Egypt during Nisan, so too again the reign of Shlomo, and by extension the reign of all kings, is counted from Nisan. So the Gemara says something very interesting. The Yitzias Mitzrayim Gufa Minolan de Nisan Maninan. So I'll say in general, how do you know that Yitzias Mitzrayim itself? How do you know that you count the anniversary of Yitzias Mitzrayim from Nisan? Now we'll say this is very interesting. In other words, that we understand. We all agree we left Egypt during Nisan. Right? Let's all agree on that point. Torah says it. Right? But how do you know that you count the anniversary of Exodus from Nisan? Maybe the anniversary Dilma Mitishrei Maniran. Maybe the anniversary we left ultimately again in Nisan, but the anniversary of when we left is reckoned from Tishrei. Lo Sakadaitcha Dichsiv. So we'll say, watch this. This is fascinating. So the Gemara says, if you look at Rashi, Ema mitishrei, afa pishiyatzu b'nisan mishegia tishrei karlo shana shniya, v'fisha tishrei rashana l'shanim. Others will say what that means is as follows. Even though we left in Nisan, Nisan, that's year one, but maybe when Tishrei came, that was already considered to be the second year since we left Egypt. In other words, how do you know that in the historical anniversary of Yitzias Mitzrayim, we're counting the years from Nisan to Nisan? Maybe we left in Nisan, but once that first Tishrei came, that's considered to be already the second year since we left Mitzrayim, and the counting goes on from there. I'll tell you why, says the Gemara. Listen to this. Dichsiv, vayal arna kohen el harahar, al pi Hashem, vayomas sham. I'll say this is incredible. We're seeing everybody today. Moshe's here, Aaron's here, Shlomo's here. It's like to your shpizim. The Gemara says, listen to this. Vayal arna kohen el harahar. Aaron went up on Horar. This is when Aaron's going to die. Al pi Hashem, vayomas sham, he dies on Horar. When? Bishnas ha'arbaim l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. He dies ultimately again on the 40th year since we left Egypt. Bechodesh hachamishi, in the 5th month. Be'echad l'chodesh. Now both say, we know. When does Aaron die? Aaron died Rosh Chodesh Av. Right, so the Chodesh HaChamishi, the 5th month over here is Av, Be'echel Chodesh, on the 1st of the month. Uksiv, and we'll say, now watch this, and what else does it say? Vahi ba'arboim shana, ba'ashtei asar Chodesh, Be'echel Chodesh, and it was in the 40th year, in the 11th month, which also we're going to see is the month of Shvat, Diber Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the people. Now both say, now here's what you have to keep in mind. Aaron dies on the 1st of Av, and the Torah calls that the 1st of Av in the 40th year. Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to the people on the 11th month, right? Ba'arba'im shana ba'ashtei asar chodesh be'echad chodesh on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and what? It still calls it the 40th year. Now watch this. Midikoi ba'av v'karli shnas arboim. Now, when Aaron dies, Rosh Chodesh Av, we're calling it the 40th year. V'kai b'shvat v'karli shnas arboim. And yet, when Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to the people, right, it still calls it the 40th year. So we'll say, how does that work? How could it be that Av and Shvat are part of the same calendar year? How does that? It only works if what? If you're counting as of when? Nisan. Because remember again, if you're counting Tishrei, then if Aaron dies in Av, and that's the 40th year, by definition, if Moshe is talking to the people in Shvat, that has to be the 41st year. If, however, you're counting from Nisan, then Aaron could die on Rosh Chodesh Av, Moshe could speak on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and they're still the same 40th year. So the Gemara says again, Midikai ba'av, if we're talking about Av v'kar leishnas arboim, you're calling it the 40th year, V'kai b'shvat v'kar leishnas arboim, and Moshe Rabbeinu was taking to the people in Shvat, and you're calling that the 40th year as well, Michlal di Rosh Hashanah lav Tishrehu. Both say that only works if in the desert, they're not counting from Tishrei. Rather, what they're doing is they're on a cycle from Nisan. Then in the desert, they're operating again. Their years are counted on the anniversary of Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh Nisan is what drives their counting. And therefore, I will say, going back, therefore, when ultimately, again, we have the pasuk comparing the reign of Shlomo to Yetzias Mitzrayim, right? What does that tell us? Just like Yetzias Mitzrayim was counted from Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so too the reign of a king is counted from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So I will say, the Gemara just delves into these psukim in just a moment. Bishlama heich mefarish Yetzias Mitzrayim. So I will say, now here's what's interesting. The death of Aaron, the pasuk explicitly says, Vayama sham ba'arboim, b'shnas arboim, l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. When Aaron dies, the pasuk explicitly says, Aaron dies in the 40th year from when we left Egypt. Elahai mimad Yetzias Mitzrayim. I will say, interestingly enough, by Moshe Rabbeinu, it just says, Vahi ba'arbaim shana. So we'll see here the difference. By Aaron, it says Aaron died in the 40th year since we left Egypt. By Moshe Rabbeinu, it says that Moshe was talking to us in the 40th year. How do you know that that's the 40th year from when we left Egypt? Maybe, Dilma la kamas hamishkan. Maybe, by Moshe Rabbeinu, it's the 40th year that the Mishkan was erected. But let's remember again, when was the Mishkan erected in the Midbar? Year 2. So maybe, in fact, it's actually a different numbers. How do you know that they're counting on the same systems? Maybe, again, by Aaron, it says explicitly, 40 years since the Exodus. By Moshe Rabbeinu, it just says the 40th year. Maybe it's counting the 40th year from the Akamas HaMishkan. Look at Rashi. Dilma me Akamas HaMishkan, Shaya b'Shana Hashenis. That was in the year number 2. To which the Gemara says, Kida Amra Papa, Shnas Esrim, Shnas Esrim L'Gzera Shava. We'll see what that means tomorrow, Meir Hashem. Hachanami, Shnas Arbaim L'Gzera Shava. Because I will say, ultimately, again, it's Gzera Shava. Wherever it says Shnas Arbaim, in other words, you don't always have to say 40 years from Yetzias Mitzrayim. But rather what? Once you say it once, it's understood that any other time we say Shnas Arbaim, it is obviously going to refer to Yetzias Mitzrayim. Ma kam Yetzias Mitzrayim, af kam Yetzias Mitzrayim. Just like by Aaron it's by Yetzias Mitzrayim, so too by Moshe Rabbeinu it's going to be for Yetzias Mitzrayim. So both sides, we'll stop over here for today. We will continue Amir Hashem delving deeper into Rosh Hashanah, into Echad B'Nisan, being the Rosh Hashanah for Malach. And I will say, Mazel Tov on the Aschal of the new Masechta. It's going to be, by the way, it is so beautiful to see such an incredible base medrash, a full base medrash. Let's keep this intensity. Let's keep this simcha going in Meretz Hashem throughout the entire Masechta. Mazel Tov on the new Aschala. Incredible, exciting beginning. Shkaya.
King A dies and King B isn't even appointed, let's say, until the end of Nisan. What do I do for the first month of Nisan?
Yeah, that's a good shot. I think the simple answer is they would not have monarchical voids like that. I don't think you have stuff like that. The fact that I don't think. What would you do?
Would you not write stars, or at least not get them?
The truth is, there are alternate, we're going to discuss this. The reason they dated by the Malachim was because of Shalom Malchus. There are other ways to date. You could date it, Hey Cheshvan Tavshin Pei Beis. So I guess if for some reason you didn't have a king, that's what you would do.
Which is what we do now.
Correct. I think.
Thank you.
Does it say Rosh Hashanah? Enjoy it then. We have more. Amen.